Audio lecture for World History, Unit 9, The Long 19th Century, the Age of Isms. The clash of the 19th century ideologies, which we as historians like to refer to as isms, because they all seem to end in ISM. In Europe, after the Napoleonic Wars were over, the conflicting ideologies of classical conservatism and classical liberalism, and I'm using the phrase classical so we know that it's different than modern day liberalism and conservatism. These conflicting ideologies shaped the 19th century after the fall of Napoleon. These will be the two dominating ideologies moving forward in this 19th century, coupled with, of course, nationalism. During the French Revolution, members of the National Assembly sat according to their political views. We've talked about this before in class. The more liberal-minded sitting on the left-hand side of the room, the more conservative-minded sitting on the right, and the more moderate sitting in the middle. Conservatives sat on the right. Traditionally, they were the ones that supported the king. Liberals, desiring a republic, sat on the left, and this is where the terms left and right remain in politics still to this day, and of course with the moderates being in the middle, as I said before. Here's the political spectrum of today, sometimes when we think about it, and you need to recognize that moving forward it's going to get more complicated. As you can see, there's dictatorships on both ends of the political spectrum. There's the extreme right wing, like the fascists, and the extreme left wing, like the communists. So we'll talk about some of these changes as we go through the 19th century and as we reach the 20th century. Conservatives, classical conservatives in the 19th century definition, believed that national, historic, and religious traditions are the essential foundations of society. So they did not want to rock the boat, making lots of massive changes. Conservatives maintained that all change should be gradual, if at all. Now remember, we're talking about the 19th century definition of conservative. You need to remove your more modern day definitions of liberal and conservative because we will not get there really until the 20th century. Those changed definitions. Conservatism, classical conservatism as we call it, appealed to those who were frightened by the social disorder, violence, and terror stimulated by the French Revolution. And so after the age of Napoleon, there will be a reaction against that kind of ideology, the more liberal promotion of the French Revolution and the changes that were brought on by the French Revolution. So this conservative reaction goes more towards monarchy and traditional institutions. Monarchy, aristocracy, the church, all represented typical classical conservative forces, not just in France, but all throughout Europe. So you can say that the classical conservatives were those that had supported absolute monarchy and had also supported the traditional institutions of religious institutions like the Roman Catholic Church. But even there were some Protestants that were also still classically conservative as well. In 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars were over, there will be a big meeting of all of the major powers of Europe at the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna, of course, meets in Vienna, which is in Austria, and it basically is a way for the leaders of Europe to redraw the boundaries of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. The conservative forces tried to reshape Europe after the French Revolution and the defeat of Napoleon to try to kind of put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, try to fix border problems that Napoleon had created by kind of erasing the traditional balance of power border lines that had been in place before the Napoleonic Wars. And they also wanted to restore legitimate rulers to the thrones throughout the European nations. Because remember that Napoleon had taken all of those monarchs off of thrones in places that he conquered, and he put his own family members on those thrones instead. So the restoration of legitimacy and conservative forces were what the majority of the European powers were after at the Congress of Vienna. Consider it a peace settlement after the Napoleonic Wars. The Emperor of Russia, he makes love for everyone. The King of Prussia, he thinks for everyone. The King of Denmark, he speaks for everyone. The King of Bavaria, he drinks for everyone. The Emperor of Württemberg, he eats for everyone. The Emperor of Austria, he pays for everyone. Clemens von Metternich was the Austrian foreign minister and the host of the Congress of Vienna. He was the right-hand man, I guess you would say, of the Austrian emperor. And so since Austria had been the first the first European nation to oppose the French Revolution, naturally they will be the ones to host the peace treaty that's going to end the wars of Napoleon, which were brought on by the French Revolution. Clemens Wenzel Nepomuk Lothair First von Metternich Wittenberg-Belstein is his full name. We'll just call him Metternich. He will shape this meeting, this summit meeting, and shape the conservative forces in Europe for the next generation. Metternich is blank in silk stockings, Napoleon had said prior to his exile. Metternich was committed to the principles of classical conservatism. He viewed liberalism and nationalism as threats to European stability. A lot of this had to do with the fact that Austria, as an empire, was a polyglot empire. It was a multi-ethnic, multinational empire. And if nationalism or classical liberalism got a foothold in Austria, it could make the entire Austrian Empire unravel. Metternich says, union between the monarchs is the basis of the policy which must now be followed to save society from total ruin. The first principle to be followed by the monarchs should be that of maintaining the stability of political institutions against the disorganized excitement which has taken possession of men's minds. Let the great monarchs strengthen their union and prove to the world that it is beneficial and ensures the political peace of Europe. The restoration of the balance of power in Europe, Metternich argued, was to restore legitimate absolute monarchs to the thrones of Europe. Monarchies were restored that had been deposed by the French Revolution and Napoleon as a result of the Congress of Vienna. First of all, in France, Louis XVIII, who was the younger brother of Louis XVI, the king who had lost his head during the Revolution, returned as the legitimate Bourbon ruler of France. Note that he took the number 18 as his king number, not 17. He did that on purpose as a show of respect to the son of Louis XVI, who would have been king had he not died in prison during the Revolution. Leaders at the Congress of Vienna sought to weaken France after, of course, the mess that had been caused by Napoleon, and then prevent it from waging wars of aggression and threatening the balance of power ever again. There is literally a royal mob here. Everybody is crying out, peace, justice, balance of power, indemnity. As for me, I am a looker on. All the indemnity I ask for is a new hat, Prince de Legene said. The victorious powers did not want to impose too punitive of a treaty on France, however, that would humiliate and antagonize them and perhaps cause the people of France to rebel again. They had had enough of that. So if you look at the map here, France before 1815, France after 1815, really before 1815, they had a little more territory in the central part of Europe. But after 1815, they lost some of that central territory, but they did not absolutely lose everything that they had gained from the French Revolution. Ultimately, the borders that they had by 1792, they were allowed to keep. Remember, this is sort of the same idea that the royal powers of Europe had when they decided not to execute Napoleon after they forced him off of the throne. They instead exiled him because they knew the people of France would revolt again, and they were trying to restore peace to Europe after so long the fighting having gone on. The Congress of Vienna enacted a settlement that ultimately would be acceptable to both the victors and to France. A compromise, if you will. The next major European conflict would not be until World War I in 1914, after 100 years of relative peace. Now, we say relative because, yes, there will be some smaller wars that take place in the interim, especially as we move into the revolutions of 1848, the Crimean War in the 1850s, the Russo-Turkish War in the 1860s, and of course the wars for unification in the 1860s and 70s. These will all be little wars, but not major European conflicts until World War I. After the Congress of Vienna, the so-called Age of Metternich takes place. For a generation, conservative forces continue to challenge classical liberalism. And we see this Age of Metternich as a time of conservative repression of any and all liberal revolts or nationalistic rebellions that happen throughout Europe. They would all be put down by a European entity called the Concert of Europe, where most of the major powers of Europe all participate in putting down any and all liberal and national revolts. They don't want another French Revolution. So that's why sometimes the Age of Metternich is also referred to as the Age of Conservatism. 1815 to roughly 1848, when we will have a series of revolutions throughout Europe. England, Austria, Prussia, and Russia all formed first what's called the Quadruple Alliance, committing them to preserve the conservative order throughout Europe. Eventually, this will give way to what it will be known as the Concert of Europe that I mentioned on the previous slide. The Holy Alliance is another thing that was formed. It was formed by Austria, Russia, and Prussia, where these Christian empires aligned to fight liberal elements in Europe that they saw as being anti-religious because they were anti-organized religion. Remember, classical liberalism is just the 19th century name for Enlightenment idealism, the rebranding, if you will, that I have said before in class. The great powers also agreed to hold periodic meetings or congresses to prevent crises from escalating into wider wars. This will be the beginning of what will be known as the Concert of Europe. And they all agreed that they would come together and put down any kind of skirmishes that may pop up. The effort to achieve a consensus on foreign policy issues is known as the Concert of Europe. This is the first experiment with collective security. Eventually, we know we will have another after World War I called the League of Nations, and then, of course, after World War II, the United Nations. The Concert of Europe, as it began to be called at the time, had a reality in international law, which derived from the final act of the Vienna Congress, which stipulated that the boundaries established in 1815 could not be altered without the consent of its 8 signatories. The Congress of Vienna disappointed classical liberals and nationalists across Europe that would eventually lead to revolts that tested the concert of Europe by the time we get into the 1830s and the 1840s. And that's where the concert of Europe will be tested. The resolve of the concert of Europe will be tested. Liberals, classical liberals, believe that government must protect the natural rights of its citizens. Remember, classical liberalism was heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. In fact, it's basically just the Enlightenment ideals updated and rebranded for the new century. What used to be referred to as Enlightenment idealism is now referred to in the 19th century as classical liberalism. Classical liberals supported civil liberties like habeas corpus rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and of course, freedom of religion. Classical liberals admired the British constitutional monarchy that favored representative government, but as opposed to full democracy. So they were not ones that supported full democracy like we had here in the United States, but they did favor representative government in terms of having a legislature that would be elected by the people and representative of the people to balance the power of the monarchy. Classical liberals also advocated economic individualism, like we just talked about with the Industrial Revolution in the previous unit, and they opposed government intervention in the economy. So they promoted the ideas of laissez-faire economic policies. They were very much in favor of the ideals of Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations. Free market economy. Most classical liberals were bourgeoisie, the middle class, remember, who wanted their views to be represented in government, and they wanted economic freedoms for businessmen. This is what will galvanize the Industrial Revolution, which will be happening simultaneously with what we're discussing politically in this unit. Working class Europeans often embraced more radically liberal ideas, even to the left of classical liberalism, which would be things like socialism, like we discussed in the previous unit, because there, of course, their conditions required significant reform. We talked about the downside of industrialization as well as the upside. Many classical liberals also supported nationalist agendas. Remember, nationalists are people who wanted independent nations, free from foreign rule, governed by the people themselves. Of course, the French Revolution itself was a kind of symbol of that nationalism, and those ideas of nationalism have been spread due to the Napoleonic Wars. So throughout Europe, there were nationalist movements going on throughout Europe, wanting, independent government, and their own government not being under another authority. So this is one reason why the Austrian Empire under Metternich and as well as the emperor, he was scared of nationalism because, of course, there were lots of different groups of people living under the Austrian Empire. And if every single one of those groups decided they wanted their independent nation, the Austrian Empire would fall apart. It's the same for other big monarchies in Europe as well. So nationalism and liberalism in the 19th century usually went hand in hand, at least in the early 19th century. In the 1830s, revolutions will sweep across Europe, driven by nationalism and liberalism. They were in opposition to at least absolute monarchy, really not monarchy in and of itself always, but at least absolute monarchy. And they had a desire for some democratic reform, meaning let's let some more people have a say in electing representatives to representative institutions and legislatures. This, of course, will be the first test of the Concert of Europe, if they will put down these rebellions to try to maintain the conservative agenda that had been established with the rebalancing of power at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, 15 years before. King Charles X now of France, and a later Bourbon ruler after Louis XVIII, attempted to restore absolutism, actually, rather than just being happy enough to be a constitutional monarch like Louis XVIII had agreed to be. King Charles X, I said, tried to turn the clock back to before 1789, before the French Revolution had happened at all. And of course, this caused a revolution in his nation in 1830, and it led to his abdication of the throne. And he instead was replaced by another branch of the royal family, another member of the branch of the royal family named Louis Philippe, who promised to rule again as a constitutional monarch instead of an absolute monarch. I would rather saw wood than be a king of the English type, Charles X said. Well, the French people happily obliged him and forced him out. And instead, Louis Philippe becomes the next king. Louis Philippe referred to himself as the bourgeois king, or the bourgeoisie king, because he saw himself to have the same ideals of the regular bourgeoisie in French society. And he agreed to rule as a constitutional monarch and not attempt to turn the clock back. Revolutionaries also helped Belgium gain independence from the Netherlands in the 1830s. So Belgium will become its own nation. So that would be a nationalist revolution that happened in the 1830s that was successful. And the Concert of Europe really did not do anything to try to stop it. Revolutionaries in Italy, called the Carbonari, rose up against foreign domination in parts of Italy. In particular, in the north, the Austrians had territories in Lombardy and Venetia, but they will be defeated. The Carbonari will not be able to successfully oust the Austrian forces out of northern Italy. Poland also in the 1830s revolted against Russia. Russia had been in control of Poland now for quite some time, but Poland will not be able to wrench itself free of Russian control. Now, another round of liberal and nationalist revolutions occurred in Europe in 1848. These will be a bit more violent than the 1830 revolutions. And overall, most of them proved to be unsuccessful. And we'll talk about why. Louis Philippe in France, who even had promised to be a constitutional monarch, even lost his throne as a result of the 1848 revolution that started in France. Despite clashes between the bourgeoisie and the workers, what they will do is they will oust their their king, Louis Philippe, and ultimately try to do a republic once again. So this will be the beginning of the Second French Republic in French history, 1848, ousting Louis Philippe. France instead decides with their Second French Republic to elect a president of the executive branch, and they elect Louis Napoleon, who was, of course, Napoleon's nephew. They elect him as president, largely by his name recognition. And 4 years later, just like his uncle, he was able to proclaim himself Emperor Napoleon III. Once again, the number 3 was taken rather than the number 2, out of respect for the son of Napoleon I, who never would have been emperor. What's interesting is that this 1848 revolution that happened in France ousted the constitutional monarch and ultimately ended up with an emperor. It seems illogical, doesn't it? Revolutionary fervor, however, spread from Paris to Vienna. Metternich was forced to resign as foreign minister of Austria as tensions grew because he was seen as the architect for this conservative repression that was common throughout Europe. And so when he resigned, he leaves basically the Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria alone to fend for himself, to try to figure out how to keep the rebellions in his empire at bay and try to see how he can restore his complete control over all parts of his empire. So the revolutions of 1848 now move into Austria. We just discussed the ones in France. Now we're talking about the ones in Austria. When France has a cold, all Europe sneezes, Metternich said. Like a revolutionary virus, if you will. Austria's ethnic diversity. I've called it before a polyglot empire. It's a multi-ethnic, multinational empire. And that ethnic diversity of Austria ultimately threatens to tear the empire apart. Because first it starts with a nationalist movement in one part of the empire, in Hungary, for example. And it was especially strong there. Then if Hungary gains its independence, what's to stop other parts of the polyglot empire from trying to gain their own independence? And this could ultimately cause all of Austrian empire to unravel. That was the problem with the 1848 revolution in Austria. The Austrian government was able to finally regain control. They had to agree to some reforms to happen, but they were able to crush the Hungarian resistance and ultimately restore order throughout the Austrian Empire. So just like we saw in France, even though the revolutionaries had some initial successes in, causing an uproar and changing some government policies, ultimately the conservative regime was able to get power back again. And France, of course, is a different conservative regime with an emperor, Napoleon III. But in Austria, we see that the Austrian emperor was able to regain control and restore order, although he did have to agree to some reforms, giving some of the Hungarians a little bit of some autonomy in their own territories. We also see the 1848 revolutions taking place in Italy. Now, we saw the earlier revolutions in the 1830s in Italy with the Carbonari failing. In 1848, a man named Giuseppe Mazzini will lead a group called Young Italy. This movement was hoping to establish a liberal republic in a united Italy. Remember, the Italian city-states had not been united since the fall of the Roman Empire. Mazzini says, "A people destined to achieve great things must one day or another form a nation-state. Italy, therefore, will be one. Her geographical conditions, her language, her literature, and the desires of her people all point to this aim." The Austrians that had had control over Lombardy and Venetia in the northern part of Italy will defeat the movement of the Young Italy movement, though. So the Italians will remain divided over unification, and the 1848 revolution in Italy will fail to unite it as one, but it will establish a precedent. The seeds of an eventual unification will be sown there, and finally in the 1860s, we will see Italy finally unify. We'll talk about that more later on in this unit. Now, our last little experiment with the 1848 revolutions, we need to talk about Prussia, okay, that in the German Confederation. In 1848, riots in Prussia led the King of Prussia to call for some reforms, trying to stave off a complete disaster. He allowed an assembly to meet in Frankfurt to draft a constitution and perhaps unite Germany. However, he did not want Germany united as a constitutional monarchy because he, Frederick William, was no constitutional monarch. He did not want to give up his absolute power. So ultimately, he does this to stave off a disaster, but Germany will not unite at this point in time because he refuses to rule as a constitutional monarch. The Frankfurt Assembly lost momentum because it was too focused on details rather than simply uniting Germany first. And ultimately, like I said before, this nationalist movement, this German nationalist movement to try to unify the German principalities will fail. And Germany will not unify until the 1870s. The seeds, however, are planted at this moment, and we'll talk more specifically about that unification movement later on in this unit. It is said that when King Frederick William IV, the King of Prussia, was offered by the Frankfurt Assembly to become the new constitutional monarch of a unified Germany, he said, "I will not accept a crown from the gutter," meaning that he had no intention of ever being a constitutional monarch. He would rather be an absolute monarch of a smaller Prussia than a constitutional monarch of a larger united Germany, because he did not want the reduction in his own personal power. The liberal revolutions of 1830 and 1848, meaning the classical liberal revolutions, forced some of those classical conservative leaders, however, to accept some reforms, even some democratic reforms, allowing more people in their nations to have a say in governing, with representation being elected in national assemblies, in legislative assemblies. So even though they may not have been successful completely getting rid of the conservative governors in these nations, we do start seeing some reforms being made. Most of the revolutions ultimately did fail. They lacked widespread support. The revolutionaries were often divided over what kind of government they wanted, meaning the middle class usually wanting classical liberalism, but the working class poor wanting more social reforms. And ultimately, that allowed for the conservative government that had been taken off guard at the beginning of the revolutions to be able to come in and reassert their authority. So that's why these 1848 revolutions are usually seen as failures, even though they might still usher in some reforms. Ultimately, conservatives were back in power at the end of the year. The revolutions all take place really within that year. By the late 1800s, liberal forces were successfully changing many Western European nations in what we will call the age of mass politics. And again, we started talking about this a little bit in the last unit. Many of those governments start to incorporate, reforms to address the calls for social reforms coming from the socialists to deal with the downside of industrialization, to try to avoid revolutions like the ones that had happened in the 1830s and 1848. We'll talk more about this age of mass politics moving forward in this unit. Now let's talk about some more of the nationalist movements in 19th century Europe. Even though the revolutions of 1848 that happened in Italy and in Prussia were not successful in uniting them, as I mentioned, the seeds of eventual unification movements, both in Italy and in Germany, were sown there and will eventually flourish in the later half of the 19th century. Nationalism was another force creating powerful changes in Europe in the 1800s. So what we've been talking about is how classical liberalism and classical conservatism clashed a bit in the early half of the 19th century. But by the time we get to the second half of the 19th century, we see nationalism coming to the forefront, and that being the galvanizing movement that causes change to happen. Nationalists believed a nation consists of a group of people who share something similar traditions, similar history, similar language. It could be religion, it could be ethnicity, any of the above can be the basis for nationalism. Nationalists argued that every nation should be sovereign and include all members of a nationality. Nationalists also insisted that a person's greatest loyalty should be to their nation. One of the earliest nationalist movements actually did happen in the first half of the 19th century instead of the second half. That was with the Greeks. In the 1830s, the Greeks earned their independence from the Ottoman Empire. This was the first successful nationalist revolution in the 19th century in Europe. As we know, the attempt of the first round of nationalist uprisings in Italy with the Carbonari had happened in 1830s, and then of course the second wave happened with Young Italy movement in 1848. We know that both of those movements had already failed to unite Italy. The Austrians in the northern part of Italy refused to let go of that part of their empire. The Pope in the central part of Italy did not like the idea of a unified Italy because he would lose his control over the Papal States. And there were also many other Italians that were opposed to unifying. Those Italian city-states had been so powerful as independent states for so long that many of them did not want to unite and lose their own autonomy. They had their own kind of nationalism, if you will, the Tuscans, the Umbrians, the Neapolitans. But there were many people that continued to argue that Italy would not be able to really challenge the rest of Europe or be on the same footing as the rest of Europe if it did not unite. Those small Italian city-states would never be able to compete with larger Western Europe if they didn't unite as one. And that was the impetus for the unification movement that begins in the last half of the 19th century. A newly renovated, rejuvenated Italian nationalism, learning from the mistakes of the earlier movements and maybe perhaps changing the path enough to achieve that goal finally. It all begins in Sardinia, Piedmont, okay? This could be seen as the magnet of the Italian unification movement in the last half of the 19th century. Sardinia, Piedmont was the only Italian state that was actually run by Italians. The others all were under the authority either of Austria or the Pope, the Papal States, or of France. Part of Naples and Sicily still was under some of the authority of the French. So Sardinia Piedmont became the center of Italian nationalism after the first two movements failed. It was led by a prime minister named Count Camillo Cavour. Count Camillo Cavour can be seen as the architect of Italian unification, and Sardinia Piedmont as the magnet or the nucleus around which Italian unification will finally happen in the second half of the 19th century. Camillo Cavour was a very savvy politician, and he recognized that perhaps the idealism of the earlier movements was not enough to get this unification done. He instead was willing to use real politics, or sometimes we call it realpolitik, which means the use of sometimes raw power, sometimes deceit, and sometimes warfare even, to get the job done. It's very Machiavellian in its approach, and we'll discuss this more as we go through this movement. Camillo Cavour also had his own newspaper in which he promoted these ideas. It was called Il Risorgimento, which basically means the resurgence. So picking up where those earlier movements had failed, but influenced by them, he continued to push the idea that Sardinia-Piedmont should be the center of a unification movement and that all of Italy could eventually unite and become stronger and be a real power on the world stage. Cavour relied on diplomacy and alliances rather than rebellions and manifestos to advance the unification movement. This is sometimes what we refer to as realpolitik or real politics. He says, "We shall not have long to wait for our opportunity. I have faith that Italy will become one state and will have Rome for its capital. But remember, among my political friends, no one believes the enterprise, the union of Italy, is possible. But he did, and he will use his diplomatic, I guess you would say, intellect to make the movement happen." Cavour's Machiavellian use of power and secret diplomacy is called realpolitik, or the politics of reality. So we will see that in Italy, he will combine the nationalist tendencies that already existed, plus his use of realpolitik to get the job done. What's interesting is this is a completely different approach than the classical liberals had done in 1830 and 1848. Instead, it's more calculated, it's more, like I say, willingness to use Machiavellian principles combined with the nationalist sentiment to actually get the job done. The study of the powers that shape, maintain, and alter the state is the basis of all political insight and leads to the understanding that the law of power governs the world of states, just as the law of gravity governs the physical world. This is what Ludwig von Rothschild wrote when he coined the term realpolitik after this kind of movement, nationalistic movement. We see a similar thing happen in Germany. Cavour knew that Austria was the biggest obstacle to Italian unification since they controlled the northern parts of Italy. So the first thing he did was create an alliance with France's now Emperor Napoleon III, the natural enemy of Austria since the French Revolution. That was smart. If he's going to get those northern states to unify with Piedmont, they're going to first have to throw out the Austrian authority there. So he needs to make a deal with Napoleon III, and he agrees to give him some territory if he supports the Piedmontian attack on Austria in the northern provinces of Italy. In 1859, the Franco-Piedmont Alliance, as it would be called, defeated Austria, allowing Sardinia to annex all of those northern Italian states except for Vienna. All of these territories now become part of a larger Piedmont or a larger Sardinia-Piedmont. This is the beginning of Italian unification. Now northern Italy, except for Venetia, is united. As Cavour united the North, he secretly also supported Giuseppe Garibaldi. He had a war going on against the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the South. This unification movement, or this nationalist movement, was also a kind of unification movement going on in the southern part of Italy. So Cavour actually helped to support Giuseppe's war in the South, hoping that then Giuseppe Garibaldi would be open to unifying with the northern part of Italy. Then all they would have to worry about is trying to get the central part of Italy under the Pope's control, under their authority, and of course Venetia that had remained independent or under Austrian influence in the north. In 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi and his small but zealous red shirt army conquered the Bourbon-controlled Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, ultimately unifying the southern part of Italy into one state. Garibaldi said, "I offer neither pay, nor quarters, nor provisions. I offer hunger, thirst, forced marches, battles, and death. Let him who loves his country follow me." And ultimately, they will oust the French governing forces and claim an independent kingdom of the two Sicilies that will eventually join with Piedmont Sardinia to form the basis of the Kingdom of Italy. It will happen finally in 1861. Italy will unite under King Victor Emmanuel II, who had been the king of Sardinia Piedmont. Venetia, or Venice, and Rome will not be part of this initial unified Italy. It will not be until 1870 that they both are forced to join. The Pope was not wild about this idea, but within 10 years or so, a new Pope had agreed that there was no way that the central part of Italy could stay out of a unified Italy. So we will have the Kingdom of Italy declared officially in 1861, but really with all pieces united by 1870. This happened with nationalism coupled with realpolitik, not with speeches, not with revolution, but with deal-making, deal-breaking realpolitik. Victor Emmanuel II said, "Our country is no longer the field for every foreign ambition. It becomes henceforth the Italy of the Italians, all of Italy being ruled by Italians rather than foreign influences that had been in place in so many parts of Italy for so many generations." The unified Italy, however, will face numerous problems. Regional rivalries were still very, very problematic. Anarchists were everywhere throughout Italy and did not like the new idea of having more government authority over them. And of course, the debts, that will always be an issue. And so even though Italy will become a constitutional monarchy around the nucleus of Sardinia Piedmont, and they will, that nucleus, that because it was a constitutional monarchy, all of Italy will become a constitutional monarchy. It will kind of reflect the nucleus. It will be, a stable state in some ways politically, but in other ways economically in particular, it will have some problems. So we need to remember this as we move towards the end of the 19th century, that yes, we have now a unified Italy, changing the balance of power in Europe, but a problematic Kingdom of Italy as we approach the 20th century and World War I. Now, in Germany, we have a unification movement happening in the second half of the 19th century as well, after the failed, attempt in 1848. Now, let's talk about Germany, which really was not a place. It was a German confederation. Germany was divided into 39 states, dominated by some of the bigger states like Austria as part of the German Confederation, and also Prussia as another part of the German Confederation. And after the Congress of Vienna, those 39 states remained the German Confederation, but there were two big personalities that didn't always agree, Austria and Prussia, on how, if they were going to unify as one common Germany, how they would do that. And ultimately, it was because Austria wanted to dominate itself and continue to be its own nation, whereas other German nationals in places like Frankfurt, the Frankfurt Assembly that met in 1848, did not want Austria to dominate, a united Germany. So that will be part of the problem. Of course, Prussia did not want to lose its sovereignty. But in 1862, the King of Prussia, King William I, also sometimes called Wilhelm I, the Prussian version of it, he will choose for his Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck was a Junker and a staunch classical conservative, and he believed that Prussia should be the nucleus around which a German nation should be formed, not Austria. Bismarck was very much a realpolitik politician. And here are the many faces of Bismarck. Bismarck was a master of realpolitik, and he sought to unite Germany on his terms, meaning also on Prussia's terms, benefiting Prussians, benefiting his king, and denying liberal reform. So, just like we saw in Italy, we will see realpolitik and nationalism come together for the unity of Germany, but the nucleus around which Germany will unify will be a very conservative Prussia, instead of, like in Italy, a more constitutionally liberal, or a constitutional monarchy, more classically liberal Sardinia, Piedmont. So when I talk about unification movements, I usually refer to the fact that they use similar methods. Italy and Germany use similar methods to unify. They use realpolitik actions coupled with nationalism, but they form very different kinds of nations in the end, because the nations that they form in the end reflect the nucleus around which they unify. In Italy, they formed a constitutional monarchy because they unified around the classically liberal Sardinia, Piedmont. In Germany, they ultimately form a more conservative government under the German Empire because they unify around the more conservative Prussia, with Bismarck at the helm as the head of state, with, of course, the Kaiser, the King, Emperor William I. Bismarck says, for the state, in contrast to the individual, self-preservation is the supreme law. The state must survive at any price. It cannot go into the poorhouse. It cannot commit suicide. In short, it must take wherever it can find the essentials of life. The less people know about how sausages and laws are made, the better they'll sleep at night. Never believe in anything until it has been officially denied. Bismarck believed that the classical liberals, like those that had attempted to unify Germany in 1848 at the Frankfurt Assembly, he believed they were incapable of solving problems and uniting Germany. He said instead, issues must be resolved with blood and iron. Warfare, raw power, even deceit, deal-making, deal-breaking. In short, realpolitik. Here's from his blood and iron speech. He says, Prussia must build up and preserve her strength for the favorable moment which has already come and gone many times, meaning the attempt to unify Germany. Her borders under the treaties of Vienna are not favorable for the healthy existence of the state. The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. Ultimately, to make a greater Prussia, they will unify Germany under Prussia. So in 1864, Bismarck will lead a series of wars, starting with a war against Denmark to gain border provinces, the border provinces of Schleswig and Holstein. By doing this, he will gain some territories for Prussia, the beginnings of German unification. He will make a deal with Austria in order to do this, saying that he will share some of these territories with Austria to get their support to attack Denmark. But Bismarck already had in mind his plan for what he was going to do with this series of wars. And ultimately, whoever is his ally in one war will be who he attacks in the next, as we will see. In 1866, Bismarck provoked Austria into declaring war on Prussia in what's sometimes known as the Austro-Prussian War or the 7 Weeks' War. How did he do this? Again, using manipulation and outmaneuvering them. Yes, they had just had a deal in two years before in the war against Denmark, but he provoked them into declaring war on Prussia so Prussia could gain the territories that they had just given to Austria. He never intended on letting them keep them in the first place. And by provoking Austria into declaring war, now Prussia looks like they are just defending themselves. Brilliant. And the concert of Europe will not come and try to stop this. It is not seen as an act of Prussian aggression, but instead of Prussia just defending itself against an aggressive Austria. Prussia will easily crush the Austrians and agree to dissolve the German Confederation. So now there's nothing to keep the rest of those German principalities from uniting under Prussian authority. No longer is there a question on who's going to lead. Is it going to be Austria or is it going to be Prussia? Now it's formally determined that those southern principalities, if they can be convinced to break their ties with France, could now become part of a greater Germany under Prussia's authority. The problem was, how are we going to do this? France had actually agreed to stay out of the German-Austrian conflict because they had no love lost for Austria. But France will not want those southern German principalities that they had close trade ties to be under Prussian authority. That's going to be the trick. In 1870, Bismarck, with the Ems dispatch, will be able to pretty much do the same thing he did with Austria before, provoke France's Napoleon III to declare war on Prussia. This happens over a series of things that you're going to read more about in your textbook and in your packet, but ultimately he snubs a French official. The French official reports back what had happened at this summit meeting, and ultimately Napoleon III feels insulted by the move, and so he declares war on Prussia. This was a huge mistake for Napoleon III. Ultimately, by doing this, he looks like the aggressor to the rest of Europe. Also, those southern German principalities that had not been sure that they wanted to join with the Greater Prussia to become Greater Germany because they had ties to France are now convinced that they should be part of a Greater Germany rather than keep their friendship with France. In 1868, there will be also a revolt in Spain. Spanish leaders wanted Prince Leopold von Hohenzollern, a cousin to the Kaiser, as their new Spanish king. France protested and his name was withdrawn. The French ambassador asked the Kaiser at Ems to apologize to Napoleon III for supporting Leopold. He refuses. This is what the snub was about. Bismarck doctored the telegram from Wilhelm, meaning William I, to the French ambassador to make it seem as though the Kaiser had insulted Napoleon III, forcing Napoleon III's hand, who was a hothead, and he declared war. It worked like a charm because that's exactly what Prussia wanted. Once again, they look like they are just defending themselves against a more aggressive France this time in the Franco-Prussian War. Prussia will be able to move into France, invading France, and force Napoleon III to surrender, capturing him in battle. Germany will unite during this last war of unification, and they will humiliate France and humiliate Emperor Napoleon III. France will once again be without an emperor. He is forced off of his throne, and France will determine to establish a new kind of government, once again attempting a republic, the Third French Republic. Back to the old drawing board. In 1871, William or Wilhelm I became the first Kaiser, just meaning emperor, of a united Germany. And he's crowned in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles with Napoleon watching on, the one who had given him this crown. The Treaty of Frankfurt contained harsh provisions for France at the end of this Franco-Prussian War. France loses control over Alsace and Lorraine, And France will seek revenge against Germany in the future. They are so angry about this. They will eventually seek revenge. And you need to remember this revenge mindset as we approach the 20th century and, of course, World War I. The unification of Germany will upset the balance of power in Europe. That balance of power that had been established at the Congress of Vienna now is all topsy-turvy. Germany rapidly industrialized, becoming the strongest continental power and a rival to Great Britain. And Otto von Bismarck says, a generation that has taken a beating is always followed by a generation that deals one. Between 1870 and 1890, Bismarck will rule as Germany's Iron Chancellor, the right-hand man to the German Kaiser under Wilhelm I. And he will dominate the liberals in the Reichstag. As the conservative, he will outmaneuver the classical liberals in the German parliament, which is called the Reichstag. He will outmaneuver them. He made nationalism a conservative cause. He will do the same thing within the Reichstag as the Iron Chancellor. He will basically take on a lot of more liberal ideas as conservative causes. He will enact reforms to outmaneuver those liberals and ultimately gain the support of most all Germans for the conservative agenda. Bismarck sought to further cement German unification by weakening the influence of the Catholic Church in the southern part of Germany, which was still dominant there. Bismarck will launch what's called a Kulturkampf, or a culture war, against the Catholics in the southern part of Germany. He's not very successful in outmaneuvering the Catholic Church in that region, but he is able to at least make it so Germany will remain unified and there will not be a secession from the southern German states after a number of years. He said, take education and marriage out of the hands of the clergy. Civil marriages only would be recognized. This is part of his Kulturkampf. The Jesuits were expelled from Germany, and the education of Catholic priests would be under the supervision of the German government. Now, as I said, this would outmaneuver some of the influence that the Roman Catholic Church had in those southern German principalities, but it will not be completely successful in the long run after the first few years. In the 1880s, Germany became the first country actually to develop a social welfare program, a state social welfare program, introducing things like universal health care and an old age pension system. Again, this is what's so odd about this. This is the age of mass politics. And we see that even though it's a conservative government, it is embracing some of these social reforms to make sure they maintain the support of the lower classes in German society. And therefore, they can continue to move and gain power for the German state. Bismarck was a master at outmaneuvering his opponents. Instead of having the socialists oppose his ideas, he ultimately took those socialist reforms as conservative ideas and outmaneuvered the socialist parties in Germany as a result. It's pretty brilliant if you think about it. Bismarck wanted to prove the benevolence of the German government and to secure the support of the working class, knowing that that would be the only way they could continue to build Germany to be a strong industrial power to challenge Great Britain. And he says, the real grievance of the worker is the insecurity of his existence. He is not sure that he will always have work. He is not sure that he will always be healthy. And he foresees that he will one day be old and unfit to work. If he falls into poverty, even if only through a prolonged illness, he is then completely helpless, left to his own devices, and society does not currently recognize any real obligation towards him beyond the usual help for the poor, even if he has been working all the time ever so faithfully and diligently. The usual help for the poor, however, leaves a lot to be desired, meaning charity, especially in large cities where it is very much worse than in the country. Bismarck hated socialism, but by allowing some socialist reforms like old age pensions, like universal health care, he prevented more significant socialist changes and again outmaneuvered the traditional socialists, making it so they didn't have anything to rebel about. Embracing some socialist reforms allowed for his other conservative agendas to be able to remain in place. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm or William I dies. And even though his son will be Kaiser for about 3 months, he dies, like I said, within 3 months. And so ultimately, it is the grandson of William I who will become William II or Wilhelm II. He takes over in 1888. Wilhelm II is a bit of a punk. That's kind of the best way I have to describe him. He said, "My grandfather considered that the office of a king was a task that God had assigned to him. That which he thought, I also think. Those who wish to aid me in that task, I welcome with all my heart. Those who oppose me in this work, I shall crush." And he and Bismarck kind of butt heads on a lot of things. Again, he was a bit of a punk. He thought that he could do things better. He was younger. He thought, I don't need this old man telling me what to do. And ultimately, they will lock horns and he will force Bismarck out. That was probably the biggest mistake that William II made because he will make some rash decisions as we move quickly into the 20th century. And he will be the one at the helm of Germany when World War I happens. In 1890, William II, Wilhelm II, forced Bismarck to resign or to retire so he could rule alone without any influence from a chancellor. He was an arrogant and impulsive leader, as I said, a punk, if you will. Forcing Bismarck out will ultimately prove to be a dumb move on his part, but he didn't care. Wilhelm II said, "There is only one master in the Reich, and that is I." This is a very famous political cartoon that was put out by a British magazine called Punch magazine. It's kind of like, Life magazine in the United States, but in England. And it's called Dropping the Pilot. And you see Bismarck, who had created this strong ship of Germany, being forced off of the deck by the punk king just in the upper part of the picture. Now let's talk a little bit more about what was going on in Russia. Conservatism will continue to reign supreme in Russia in the last half of the 19th century. Now we know that Russia has been backward behind the rest of Europe since the beginning of this course. We know that it had been under that Mongol yoke during the Middle Ages that kind of kept it isolated from the rest of Western Europe. And that will ultimately make them be kind of in the back seat of modernization. There had been attempts at modernization and reform in Russia that we have covered in this course before, but many of them were met with conservative reactions and an unwillingness of sometimes leaders to accept less power in exchange for those reforms and modernization. We know that in the 1750s, Russia had experienced some significant, really, westernization under Peter the Great, but ultimately that would be stunted later on by his successors. So, also, that Catherine the Great had tried to embrace westernization a couple of generations after Peter the Great as an enlightened despot. She sought liberal reforms for Russia, but ultimately they will be really no more than on paper because of the challenges that she has within society. We know that there was a big peasant rebellion against some of what she was attempting to do. Emelian Pugachev, a Cossack demanding land redistribution, lower taxes, and the end of the military draft, led an uprising of serfs against Catherine the Great, not liking that she had taken the church lands from the church and sold them off to the nobles. He wanted them instead to be redistributed to the Russian serfs and wanted the end of serfdom. And ultimately, this rebellion will be put down by Catherine the Great. Pugachev had said, "From me, such reward and investiture will be with money and bread compensation and with promotions. And you, as well as your next of kin, will have a place in my government and will be designated to serve a glorious duty on my behalf. If there are those who forget their obligations and dare not to carry out the command that my devoted troops are to receive weapons in their hands, then they will see for themselves my righteous anger and then be punished harshly." He was trying to take over the government, folks, and Catherine wasn't having any of that. Pugachev's rebellion was crushed and marked the end of Catherine's reforms and a recommitment instead to absolute rule in Russia. She says, "I shall be an autocrat, that's my trade, and the good Lord will forgive me, that's his." So she wanted to be an enlightened despot, but ultimately after this test, she said, "Nope, I will be an autocrat, the Lord will forgive me." Catherine sought territorial expansion for Russia as well, and this will bring her into conflict with the Ottoman Empire in the south. Russia was able to gain access to the Black Sea and expanded into Europe and Central Asia during her reign. But ultimately, there will be some challenges to her successors to keeping control over these territories. By the time we get to the early 19th century, Tsar Alexander I, as we know, the Tsar during the Napoleonic Wars, in 1812, Tsar Alexander I led Russia's resistance of Napoleon as Napoleon attempted to invade Russia, and he vowed to combat liberal forces by joining the Holy Alliance in 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars were over. So he will continue in the autocrat role as we go into the early 19th century. He said, "Liberty should be confined within just limits, and the limits of liberty are the principles of order." Order was more important to him than liberty. In 1825, Tsar Alexander I died, and this led to a revolt led by some army officers in 1825, in December of 1825, and this is why it is called the Decembrist Revolt. Many of these army officers saw this as an opportunity to perhaps now demand some constitutional reforms. They had been influenced by classical liberalism. They had been spreading throughout Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, and they wanted to try to influence the next czar to embrace those reforms like some previous czars had tried and failed to. Ultimately, this Decembrist revolt will be crushed by the next guy in line for the throne. Tsar Nicholas I will ruthlessly suppress the Decembrist revolt, and Russia will become the most conservative government in Europe under Nicholas I. Sometimes you will see his name spelled with the H, Nicholas. Sometimes you'll see it without. The H is more of a westernized spelling versus the Russian spelling, but still you might see it both ways. Both are correct. In the early 1800s, the Russian leaders, as I said, resisted calls to westernize and industrialize. Under Tsar Alexander I, we see it first, maintaining the feudal system and serfdom, and certainly under his successor, Tsar Nicholas I. Tsar Nicholas I will be a reactionary conservative, actually, and not only maintain serfdom, but maybe even turn the clock back 100 years or so in terms of liberties that people may have been able to gain earlier in the rule of Alexander I. In 1853, Tsar Nicholas I saw an opportunity to maybe gain some more territory in the Black Sea Balkans region, attacking once again the old, enemy of the Russians, the Ottoman Empire to the south. So he saw the opportunity to defeat the Ottomans and secure access to the Mediterranean through the Turkish Straits by trying to gain control over the Crimean Peninsula and the Bosphorus Strait. This will be the beginning of the Crimean War. In the Crimean War, however, the concert of Europe will come to the aid of the Ottoman Turks. France and Britain opposed Russian expansion in the Balkans region. They did not really care so much about the Ottoman Empire, so they really were not coming so much to the defense of the Ottoman Empire as much as they were trying to keep the Russians from expanding into this territory. Both the British and the French had economic interests. They had imperial territories in the Middle East, and they did not want Russia to gain more territory in this region that might challenge their economic interests in the region. So ultimately, the Crimean War will be an abject failure for Russia because they had not modernized, and of course, Great Britain and France had. Great Britain and France will bring that industrial technology to warfare in their support of the Ottoman Empire against the Russians, and it will be a bloodbath for the Russians. A historian writes, the Crimean War was fought for the sake of Europe rather than for the Eastern question, meaning what should happen to a weakening Ottoman Empire. It was fought against Russia, not in favor of Turkey. The British fought Russia out of resentment and supposed that her defeat would strengthen the European balance of power. Russia's humiliating defeat in the Crimean War forced the son of Nicholas I, who became the Tsar in the middle of the war when his father died supposedly of a broken heart by the losses that Russia was receiving in the war. Tsar Alexander I, now at the end of this war, has to clean up his father's mess. And he decided to take a completely different approach, took a complete 180, and wanted to launch an ambitious program called the Great Reforms to finally maybe start westernizing Russia. He was convinced that they needed to do so after seeing how humiliated Russia was, how obliterated they had been by the Western powers. They would never be able to compete if they did not modernize. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II did the first of his big reforms by issuing the Emancipation Edict, which freed all of the Russian serfs, something that Catherine the Great and Peter the Great had never done. He freed the Russian serfs, but they were not given land. So therefore, they really were not left any better off than they were as serfs. Serfs in Russia, over 55% in the red areas, 36 to 55% in the dark purple areas, less than 36%, or no debt available in the lighter ones. Tsar Alexander II said, "My intention is to abolish serfdom. You can yourself understand that the present order of owning souls cannot remain unchanged, because Russian serfdom was more like slavery. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for that time when it starts to abolish itself from below," meaning slave rebellion. Tsar Alexander II, 1856. In 1864, Alexander introduced a system of local and regional self-government through elected assemblies called zemstvos. This was his attempt at beginning the idea of local governing that could then answer back to him as the Tsar. And it was a show to many that maybe he was adopting some classical liberal ideas. Maybe this was the beginning of Russia eventually becoming a constitutional monarchy. If he would allow for zemstvos and regional government, perhaps he would allow for the creation of a national legislature. And maybe Russia could finally start catching up to Western Europe. The Zemstvos members included nobles, small landowners, the clergy, wealthy townsmen, less wealthy urban classes, and actually some peasants. 74% of Zemstvos members were nobles, though, even though they made up only 1.3% of the population. So ultimately, they weren't as equal as they had looked on paper initially. The Zemstvos provided the opportunity for public discussion, at least, but it didn't really lead to the creation of a national assembly or limit the Tsar's power, as many had hoped. By 1881, there was an assassination attempt. The first one missed him, but the second one got him. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II ended Russia's brief period with reform. And the amount of industrialization that Alexander II had started the process of in Russia would be halted by his successors. So Russia had just started to modernize, and with the assassination of Alexander II by a group of anarchists, by the way, that will end that. And Russia will become once again a staunchly reactionary force in Europe. The explosion knocked me into the fence. Suddenly, amid the smoke and snowy fog, I heard His Majesty's weak voice cry, "Help!" His Majesty was half lying, half sitting, leaning on his right arm, thinking he was merely wounded heavily. I tried to lift him, but the Tsar's legs were shattered, and the blood poured out of them. 20 people with wounds of varying degree lay on the sidewalk and on the street. There was an explosion. Some managed to stand, others to crawl. Still others tried to get out from beneath bodies that had fallen on them. Through the snow, debris, and blood, you could see fragments of clothing and bloody chunks of human flesh. The Tsar will die. Tsar Alexander III will be the next Tsar, who will reign from 1881 to 1894. And then after him will be Tsar Nicholas II, who will rule from 1894 to 1917, when he is overthrown by the Russian Revolution. Both of these czars were committed to traditional autocratic rule, and the reform process that was begun by Tsar Alexander II will come to an end. Russia attempted to industrialize, as I said, starting under Alexander II's reign, by building railroads in particular. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was the biggest achievement, and the expanding coal and steel production that would result of that. But ultimately, had he survived, this would have been an even bigger, it would have expanded even further. It would have been, but it was be halted as a result of his assassination. Russia's rapid industrialization that had started under Tsar Alexander II, but the lack of authentic political reform led to the emergence of various political movements, some of which will eventually, bubble up during the reign of the last Tsar, Nicholas II. Sergei Witt was a Russian minister of finance who was kind of put in charge of the building of the railroads, said, "The present movement for freedom is not of new birth. Its roots are embedded in centuries of Russian history. Freedom must become the slogan of the government. No other possibility for the salvation of the state exists. The march of historical progress cannot be halted. The idea of civil liberty will triumph, if not through reform, then by the path of revolution. The government must be ready to proceed along constitutional lines, which it had started under Alexander II, but with his killing stopped. The government," Sergei Witt was saying, "must sincerely and openly strive for the well-being of the state and not endeavor to protect this or that type of government. There is no alternative. The government must either place itself at the head of the movement which has gripped the country, or it must relinquish it to the elementary forces to tear it to pieces. And ultimately, he was sending a warning that, this movement that had been started by Alexander II was not going to go away, that the people were not going to be satisfied with just a little bit that they had received that was then yanked away by the next two reactionary rulers, that eventually there would be rebellion. And as we know, it will happen in 1917. The Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets as they were called, wanted a constitutional monarchy and were not happy under the now reinforced autocratic rule of both Alexander III and then Nicholas II. Paul Milukov, the leader of the Cadets, said, "It will be our task not to destroy the government, which would only aid anarchy, but to instill in it a completely different content, that is, to build a genuine constitutional order. That is why in our struggle with the government, despite everything, we must retain a sense of proportion. To support anarchy in the name of the struggle with the government would be to risk all." By 1903, the Social Democrats that were working for economic and political revolution will split, however, into two groups. That splintering will form the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks being the most Marxist of the two groups. You can see the handwriting on the wall here for the future communist revolution that will happen in Russia. The Mensheviks favored gradual socialist reforms. Menshevik meaning minority. The other group will be the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Now, Lenin had been a proclaimed Marxist for many years, and he had favored a communist revolution based on what Marx had said should happen. But he put his own spin on things, saying that that communist revolution needed to be led by a small elite group of professional revolutionaries that would deliver the revolution to the people. Ultimately, it will be these Bolsheviks that will continue to grow in the coming, decade or so, and they will eventually be the ones that launch a revolution against the Tsar in Russia in the midst of World War I. We'll talk more about that in a later unit. The next thing we're going to talk about in the 19th century with this age of isms is the women's rights movement that is going to happen, or the rise of the feminism movement in Western Europe. Now, really, one could say that the beginning of the feminism movement really began back in the Enlightenment. Many women believe that the values of the Enlightenment, of equality, liberty, democracy even, should apply to all men and to women. The feminist movements demanding women's rights emerged in France, in Britain, and in the United States. And they all challenged the political and gender hierarchies that existed in all of those countries. Now, as I said, there were roots to the women's rights movements that could be traced back to the Enlightenment and also to the French Revolution. As we know, many French women hoped the revolution would grant them rights equal to men. We saw those women march to Versailles, the Women's Bread March. We saw them gain some rights during the early phase of the French Revolution. Citizenship, not quite suffrage yet, meaning the right to vote, but at least citizenship. But a lot of that was removed by Napoleon. We know also that during the French Revolution in 1791, Olympia de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. After seeing that the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen that was released that same year by the National Assembly during that early phase, the moderate phase of the French Revolution, excluded women. And she argued that women should be given the same opportunities as citizens as men in this new experiment that they are embarking upon in France. De Gaulle demanded that French women be given the same rights as French men, that they could be just as good citizens as men. We also need to look at the roots in the women's rights movement, in the feminism movement, by looking at a British woman named Mary Wollstonecraft. She was an English author who in 1792, being influenced by Olympia de Gouges, having been living in France, seeing firsthand what had happened with the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen, decided to write her own book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. In this book, she argued a lot of things, but in particular, she argued that women should be able to receive equal education to men. Therefore, they could become good, well-informed citizens and could make good political decisions. The argument by many was that women should not be equal citizens because they were not well enough educated to make good decisions. And her argument back was, well, then educate them equally and they will make good political decisions. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication ultimately becomes like the Bible of the feminist movement moving forward, both in England and in France, and eventually spreading to other areas, even the United States. And by the way, Mary Wollstonecraft is the mother of the author Mary Shelley that writes the Gothic novel Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft argued that women appear inferior to men only because of that lack of education, and the solution would be to educate them. She says, make women rational creatures and free citizens, and they will quickly become good wives. That is, if men do not neglect the duties of husbands and fathers. John Stuart Mill, who we discussed before as one of those utilitarians in the British government, in the British Parliament in the 1820s and 30s. English utilitarian who invented the word feminism, actually. He had actually denounced the legal and social inequalities women faced. He was one of the earliest proponents of women's rights in the British government. But unfortunately, most did not think the same way he did, at least not at that particular time. He says, the legal subordination of one sex to another is wrong in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. It ought to be replaced by a system of perfect equality, admitting no power and privilege on the one side, nor disability on the other. He also said, under whatever conditions and within whatever limits, men are admitted to the suffrage, meaning given the right to vote. There is not a shadow of justification for not admitting women under the same, giving women the vote. Many Europeans saw the ideal middle-class woman as an angel in the house, the family's moral guardian, and therefore she should not be involved in politics. Most women, however, were in the workforce, and many of them were single. Few married women worked outside the home as we go through the second industrial revolution, or from the lower classes. So we see most women in the workforce were single or from the lower classes. Those that were in the middle class were the ones that were able to stay home. Law codes in most European countries gave women very few legal rights. We discussed this as part of the problem with the Napoleonic Code. It kind of took some of those legal rights that women had gained in the French Revolution away. Women's experiences. In the 1840s and 1850s, women began to demand political rights and believed that suffrage was the key to improving their overall position. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst in England founded the Women's Social and Political Union in Britain and used unusual publicity stunts to draw attention to her cause. She was often thrown into jail for her actions. She argued that by doing so, she got her name in the paper and she got stories in the paper about this push for women's suffrage. And there was no such thing as bad publicity. We see the same kind of thing happening in the United States. In 1848, the Women's Rights Convention met in Seneca Falls, New York, demanding voting rights for women. This was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. The New Jersey State Assembly said, women, generally, are neither by nature, nor habit, nor education, nor by their necessary condition in society, fitted to perform this duty of voting, with credit to themselves or advantage to the public. So you can see they were fighting an uphill battle. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote ultimately the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, stating that all men and women were created equal. What she did was very similar to what Olympia de Gouges had done back in the 1790s in response to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. She says, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise, meaning the vote. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. In 1857, divorce was actually legalized in Britain and in France in 1884. Catholic countries like Spain and Italy still didn't permit it, but this was at least a step in the right direction. Ultimately, the women's rights movement had many members, but enjoyed few successes. By 1900, no major countries allowed women to vote, but that will change after World War I.